They said growing up in a preacher's home meant being surrounded by faith, discipline, and love. But for Paul Morton's son, it was something else entirely. His life wasn't the picture perfect world people imagined when they looked at his famous father standing under the church lights. Behind the glowing stage and the joyful choir, there were things people never saw: pressure, expectations, and secrets that quietly shaped his childhood. From the outside, he looked blessed. The world saw him as the son of a gospel legend. But inside, he carried a weight that few could understand. You won't believe how heavy that name really was for him. Paul Morton was a respected man, a bishop, a gospel singer, and a leader whose voice touched millions. People saw him as chosen by God, a man who built churches, guided pastors, and led souls to faith. But for his son, that greatness came with a silent cost. Imagine being born into a family where your father isn't just admired, he's worshipped. Every time you walk into a room, people look at you differently. You are no longer just you. You are the bishop's son. And that title came with rules that were never spoken, but always understood. He had to act right, talk right, even pray right. One small mistake could turn into a rumor whispered through the church pews. He once said it felt like living in a world where every move was being watched. While other kids could laugh, fail, or mess up, he couldn't. His mistakes didn't stay private, they became public judgment. Growing up, he often felt like he was living in a glass box. People saw him, but they never really knew him. They saw his father's reflection, not his own identity. And that confusion followed him everywhere. He didn't know if he truly believed in what he was told to believe, or if he was simply performing what others expected from him. Let me tell you, that kind of life doesn't build you. It breaks you slowly and silently. From a young age, he saw both sides of the church world. He saw the powerful sermons, the music, the passion, and the praise. But behind that beauty, he also saw something else: the exhaustion, the pressure, and the endless demand for perfection. The same people who shouted hallelujah on Sunday were often the same ones who gossiped and criticized behind closed doors. He learned early that church life wasn't always holy. It was human, and sometimes painfully so. But here's the shocking part. Even when he wanted to question what he saw, he couldn't. His family name wouldn't allow it. He once described his childhood as being caught between two worlds, one sacred and one real. In the sacred world, he was expected to smile, to represent holiness, to live without flaw. But in the real world, he was a young man trying to understand who he was. He wanted to laugh, make mistakes, explore life like everyone else. Yet every time he tried, someone reminded him, "You're the bishop's son." It felt like a curse disguised as a blessing. And this is where it gets interesting, because the more he tried to be perfect, the more he started to lose himself. As the years passed, the pressure grew heavier. He wasn't just a preacher's kid anymore. He was becoming a young man with doubts and questions that he couldn't ignore. Why did he have to live up to standards that no one else could? Why did faith sometimes feel like performance? Why did the church demand perfection when it preached forgiveness? Those questions started to echo inside him, and they refused to be silent. He tried to hide them, to stay obedient, to be the good son, but deep down, something was changing. He started feeling trapped inside his own life. The sermons that once inspired him began to feel like chains. The church that was supposed to be his home started to feel like a cage. And you won't believe what he said later, that sometimes he sat in church surrounded by people praising God, and yet he felt completely alone. He smiled because he had to. He sang because it was expected. But inside, he was breaking. He began to realize that maybe he wasn't living his own faith at all. He was living his father's. He wanted to talk to someone, to be honest about his pain, but how could he? His father was a bishop. His family was the image of holiness. Admitting that he was struggling would sound like betrayal. So he stayed silent, carrying his confusion like a secret that no one could see. The church world admired his family, but he began to resent the image they had to maintain. He didn't hate his father, he loved him deeply, but he hated the mask they had to wear. The pressure to be perfect was suffocating. The expectations were endless, and little by little, that silence began to change him from the inside out. He started questioning everything, the sermons, the people, even his own beliefs. And what makes this story different? It wasn't a sudden rebellion. It was a slow, quiet breakdown of someone who had spent his whole life trying to live up to something impossible. He began to see the cracks behind the church walls, the politics, the jealousy, the judgment. He started realizing that behind the holy smiles were human struggles, secrets, and scars, but he couldn't talk about it. Not yet, because as much as he wanted freedom, he was still chained by fear. Fear of what his father would think, fear of how the church would react, fear of losing everything he had ever known. That anger he carried inside began to grow, slowly turning into a storm he couldn't control. The more he tried to bury it, the stronger it got. Every Sunday sermon, every forced smile, every time someone said, "You're just like your father," it felt like another piece of him was breaking. He didn't want to be his father, not because he hated him, but because he wanted to be himself. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of fighting the system openly, he started drifting away quietly. At first, it was small, skipping church meetings, avoiding choir rehearsals, staying out late. No one noticed at first. But deep down, he was preparing to break free. He once said that he used to look at the pulpit, the very stage where his father preached, and feel two things at once: pride and pain. Pride because that was his dad, a man who inspired thousands. Pain because he knew that behind that powerful image was a family quietly struggling to hold everything together. The church members saw glory. He saw exhaustion. They saw strength. He saw loneliness. And you won't believe what he revealed years later, that sometimes his father would come home after preaching fire and miracles, only to sit in silence, lost in his own thoughts. That silence haunted him, because for the first time, he realized even the strongest men can be broken in private. But instead of bringing them closer, that realization pushed them further apart. He started seeing his father as someone who belonged more to the world than to him. The man who could comfort thousands didn't know how to comfort his own son. He began to resent the church for taking his father away, for turning his family into symbols instead of humans. That resentment became rebellion. And the craziest part, his rebellion didn't start with anger, it started with silence. He stopped sharing, stopped praying, stopped caring. He built walls so high that not even his family could reach him anymore. He started spending time with people outside the church circle, people who didn't care about religion, image, or reputation. For the first time, he felt unseen in a way that felt safe. No one expected him to be holy. No one reminded him of his last name. He could laugh, curse, question, and breathe freely. But here is the shocking part, that freedom came with a price. He began exploring things that went against everything he was raised to believe. Late night parties, wrong company, and choices he knew his father would never forgive. But in his mind, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. It was the only way to escape the pain of being perfect. The rumors began quietly, as they always do. Church members started whispering that the bishop's son was losing his way. Some said he was seen in places he shouldn't be. Others claimed they had heard things. Every whisper felt like another wound to his father's name. But instead of returning to the church and apologizing, he drifted even farther. You see, once someone tastes the feeling of living without judgment, it's hard to go back to living under constant eyes. And though he didn't say it out loud, he felt betrayed, not by God, but by the people who claimed to represent him. His relationship with his father became tense. Conversations turned into arguments. The love was still there, but it was buried under years of unspoken pain. His father couldn't understand why his son was slipping away. He thought maybe it was temptation or weakness, but in truth, it was something deeper. It was the need to be real. The son wanted honesty, the father wanted obedience. Both loved each other deeply, but both were trapped by the expectations of the world watching them, and destiny once again took an unexpected turn. Because one day, something happened that no one saw coming, a confrontation that would change everything. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. Secrets that had been buried for years came to the surface. And for the first time, the bishop's perfect family didn't look so perfect anymore. The tension that had been quietly building exploded, and from that moment on, nothing was ever the same. That confrontation became the breaking point. It didn't happen in front of a crowd, not during a sermon or a family gathering. It happened behind closed doors, in a quiet room where truth finally spilled out. His father, the man everyone saw as unshakable, demanded answers. "Why are you doing this to our family?" he asked. But his son, filled with years of bottled up pain, couldn't stay silent anymore. He said, "I'm not destroying the family. I'm just tired of pretending we're perfect when we're not." Those words cut deeper than either of them expected. You won't believe how quickly that room filled with silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that makes your heart heavy. For the first time, both of them faced what they had been avoiding. Their lives were built on appearances, not understanding. His father saw a son who had turned away from God. The son saw a man who had turned away from him. The truth is, neither of them was completely right or wrong. They were just two broken souls trying to love each other through the pain of expectations. And here is where it gets interesting. That night didn't end in forgiveness or healing. It ended in distance. The son walked away, and the father let him go, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how to stop him. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The bishop's son disappeared from the church world. Some said he moved away. Others said he fell into a dark path. Rumors became stories, and stories turned into judgment. People whispered things like, "How could Bishop Morton's son do this?" Or, "He had everything. Why throw it all away?" But no one asked the real question, what was he running from? Behind those rumors was a young man struggling to find peace, searching for something that religion had failed to give him: freedom. In his loneliness, he began to reflect. Away from the noise of church politics and public expectations, he started seeing things differently. He realized that his anger wasn't really toward God. It was toward the system that used God's name to control and judge. The sermons that once made him feel guilty now made him think deeper. He started reading scripture again, but this time not as a preacher's son, as a man searching for truth. And you won't believe what he discovered: that God was never the one who wanted him to be perfect. That pressure had come from people, not from heaven. That realization hit him like a wave. For the first time in years, he cried, not because of guilt, but because of relief. He realized that maybe God wasn't angry at him for leaving. Maybe God was waiting for him to come as he was, broken, lost, and real. But destiny, as always, had another twist waiting. Just as he started to find his footing again, news reached him. His father had fallen ill. The man who once seemed untouchable was now weak and frail. It broke him in a way he didn't expect. All that anger he had carried suddenly felt meaningless. The distance, the arguments, the rebellion, none of it mattered anymore. He rushed to see his father. The same house that once felt like a prison now felt like a memory of love he had nearly lost. When he walked in, the bishop was lying in bed, still proud but visibly tired. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them carried years of pain, regret, and love. And then his father said softly, "You've always been my greatest blessing, even when I didn't know how to show it." That sentence shattered every wall the son had built. He broke down, crying not as the bishop's son, but as a child who had missed his father's embrace. But here's the craziest part. That moment didn't erase the past, it revealed it. They finally saw each other not as preacher and son, but as two men learning to forgive. The father admitted that he had placed too much weight on image, and the son confessed that he had allowed bitterness to blind his heart. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was real, something they both had been craving for years. And as he sat by his father's bedside, holding his hand, he realized something powerful, that sometimes God lets things fall apart, not to punish, but to rebuild what was broken. He understood now that faith wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about finding grace in your imperfection. But destiny wasn't done yet, because just when peace started to settle in, something unexpected happened that would test everything he had just learned. That moment of peace didn't last long. Just when he thought everything had finally calmed down, life threw one last curveball, the kind that no one can ever truly prepare for. Only a few months after their reconciliation, his father's health began to decline rapidly. The man who once stood tall behind the pulpit, commanding thousands with his voice, could now barely whisper a prayer. Watching that change broke something inside him. You won't believe how hard it was for him to accept that the man who once seemed immortal was now fading away. Every visit felt heavier than the last. The house that had once been filled with music and laughter now echoed with quiet prayers and memories. He would sit beside his father, listening to the steady rhythm of the oxygen machine, wishing he could turn back time, back to before the arguments, before the silence, before the pain. But destiny had already made its choice. The day finally came when the bishop, Paul Morton, the giant in his eyes, took his final breath. And in that moment, the son felt something he had never felt before, not just loss, but peace. Here is the shocking part. As tears streamed down his face, he realized that his father's greatest gift wasn't his legacy or fame, but the lesson he left behind: you don't have to be perfect to be loved. Standing at the funeral, surrounded by thousands who had come to honor the bishop, the son felt an unexpected strength. He stepped up to the podium, not as the broken child he once was, but as a man who had finally found his voice. And what he said that day silenced the entire room. He didn't talk about achievements or titles. He talked about forgiveness, truth, and the cost of carrying someone else's expectations. He told the crowd, "My father was a great man, but he was also a man who struggled, and that's what made him real." For years, I tried to be his shadow, but today, I finally choose to stand in my own light. The crowd, stunned by his honesty, erupted into applause. Even those who had once judged him felt something shift in their hearts. Because in that moment, the story of the bishop's son was no longer about rebellion. It was about redemption. After the service, as the sun began to set, he walked outside the church, the same church that had once felt like a cage, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I forgive you, Dad. And I forgive myself." The wind carried his words, soft and certain, as if even heaven had been waiting to hear them. But here's where it gets interesting. That wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Instead of running from the church, he decided to rebuild his faith on his own terms. He didn't become a preacher like his father, but he did something just as powerful. He began sharing his story with others who had felt trapped by expectations. He told them that faith wasn't about fear, it was about freedom, that God didn't want perfection, he wanted honesty. And slowly, his voice began to touch lives, just like his father's once had, but in a completely different way. People who had once judged him now found comfort in his words. They saw themselves in his pain and his healing. And that's what made his journey so powerful. It wasn't polished, it wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The son of a bishop, once lost in rebellion and silence, had become a voice of truth and restoration. And as he often said in his later years, destiny doesn't always take the path we expect. Sometimes it has to break us just to bring us back home. That's how a story that began with pressure and pain ended in peace and purpose, proving that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that lead us straight into grace.